I am here for you in whatever that needs to look like for this drug. So if you need help, you get all the way down the road and you go to do that first injection at home and you get shaky and you just, you forgot that the video existed or you're not comfortable, it's a whole lot easier to call me.
Welcome to That's Derm Good. I'm Janelle Ball, and I'm excited to bring you thought-provoking conversations about biologics, specialty medications, treatments, and so much more. I'll be chatting with some amazing guests about access, affordability, and advocacy. You're really going to enjoy this show. Welcome to That's Derm Good. Today, my guest is Brie Hutchings. Brie is a biologic coordinator and the director of education for BC Educators. Thank you, Brie, for joining me.
Hi, Janelle. How are you this morning?
Good.
Good.
I was so excited to have the time to sit down and chat with you just about your experience and knowing that I actually met your mom at a conference before I met you.
You did.
Yeah, your mom is like been in the game and everybody knows her.
I know. It's a big shadow to fall in. But it's also kind of exciting to continue that. And it was so natural to I didn't feel like I had to live up to her or she expected me to go into this field.
Mhm.
It was like breathing. It was such a part of my life forever. And it was so important to me from such a young age that what else would I have done? Where else would I have gone? So it is
Mhm.
definitely having the last name shared is sometimes a little daunting because there's never a bad note. It's always, oh my gosh, your mom, blah, blah, blah. Your mom helped me with this. I saw your mom at so and so. And I'm like, I'm not her. I promise I'm not that good, but I'm really gonna try. So
Well, you're pretty amazing too. Just getting to know you over the last, what, maybe it
six
hasn't even
months,
been
a
a full
year.
year. Yeah.
No,
But having you on the team for BC Educators has been so amazing. But just your knowledge and, growing up in the space, I think is so cool. So I'd love to hear about that experience and why you decided to kind of follow in your mom's footsteps and get into dermatology and being a biologic coordinator.
absolutely. So, like you said, I grew up in this space. So, my mom started working at a derm office at 21. So, when I was born, several years later, like the doctors that worked there were some of the first people to hold me as an infant. So, it was a practice that was family initiated and has been around for a very, very long time, is quite large now. But my mom started with their dad and the brothers. So, she was like, the adopted child or the adopted kind of grandchild. I was one of the first of the kids of that generation of the staff. So it was just part of every day. I grew up as an only child. I have a half sister who's much older. So it was me and my mom at home every day. So our dinner table conversations were, hey, how was school? How was work? And it was, what was the coolest case of the day? Or what was the frustration? What's this new development? The practice also does clinical research. So as biologics were becoming a thing and starting to exist, they were part of that journey. So she was doing those letters of intent, having to prove to insurances that psoriasis wasn't just cosmetic, that it
Mhm.
was an actual condition. And so we've seen such a change over time that I got to watch from the sidelines for a very long time. And it mattered to me because of how much it mattered to her. And she never preached it. It was never expected of me to go into this field. But when you see someone who cares that much and has dedicated their entire adult life essentially to
Mhm.
this and has grown from being, working at the front desk to being derm tech to now she's working in pharma on the access side as well, it just I didn't have to buy in because I was already in. It already was ingrained in me and super important to me. So I thought for a while I would go and be a doc. And then I thought about it and went, I can do more for a patient in a role like this. Doctors are
Mhm.
so important and there's so much value there. But ultimately, they can write the script all day long. If the patient doesn't get it, it doesn't matter. So who's going to fight that fight? And that's kind of always what I've said is I'm a champion on behalf of the patient and the doctor. I don't care what they decide. That's not my job. Once they make that decision for that treatment, how do I make sure that patient understands what's happening and make sure we're getting them on the right track? Um, So yeah, it's just I grew up like I remember being a kid and going to work with my mom or stopping by in high school. There were patients who had seen pictures of me through my whole life, and as I got older and was shadowing in the office, there's one patient in particular I remember. My mom was working on him. She was doing a procedure, and she goes, "Hey, this guy wants to see you. He's seen all these baby pictures of you, whatever." And I walked in the room, and it was the first time I had ever held a patient's hand while they were having a procedure done. And I was 16, 17, maybe shadowing. And he said, "I know you don't know me, but I've known you your whole life." Fast forward to when I started working for that practice, I was 21, 22, and he came in and he looked at me and he knew who I was immediately. And we both burst into tears because it was that my mom had seen him for 30 years and it was that continuation. And he knew looking at me that the same care that my mom provided, he could find in me. Even if I
Mhm.
wasn't quite sure how to do it, even if I didn't have all the answers, I had that dedication and heart. And those are the moments that made it just crystal clear to me. Like it was never an option to not do this. It was never an option not to follow in her footsteps, but to just continue fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
So
I love that. I'm like almost getting teary-eyed here just
yeah,
listening
I
to
had
your
to take
story.
a sip of my drink because it makes me teary-eyed all the time. I actually called him this morning and said, "Hey, I'm going to vaguely talk about you on a podcast if that's all right," because he's just a phenomenal human. So
That is amazing. It just brings you back to why we do this in the first place. Supporting our patients and making sure that we are being an advocate for them and helping them. And we have that knowledge. We have the ability to be able to do that. So, and I've said this before, why not? Why not
right.
support them? Why not do the best that we can to really provide that support and that education and training and all of those resources that our patients really need to get the medications that they need so that they can get better. I mean, that's why we got into this field in the first place. So I love that story.
It's a daunting task, I think, to take all of that on, to go from just doing those prior auths to the patient access and education and the provider education and advocacy. Like that seems like a lot because it is. But part of what makes that work is that you buy in, right? You understand how important that is. You have that empathy and compassion
Mhm.
because you've either worked in an office as an MA and seen this in person, or you have a family member, or you yourself have a condition. I feel like across the board, everyone has some sort of experience that made it click why this matters. You can do it all day. But, if you're just doing paperwork, it's just paperwork. If you're just making phone calls, it's just phone calls. So those are the moments that when my day is really full or my plate is, I'm just spread thin and nothing is going my way, I think about those patients that do have that level of thankfulness. They're so grateful for what we do. And they will tell you at the drop of a hat how much it has changed their life just to have someone that they know they can reach out to that's on their side.
Right.
No question. That's why I do what I do. And I love it every day.
Yeah. So when did you start working in the derm office officially?
Officially is kind of the key there. So I went to school briefly in San Diego. I went to San Diego State right after high school. COVID happened. I came home because San Diego completely locked down. Like you couldn't go down the hall. You were in your dorm room. So I
Mhm.
came home in the thick of COVID when the office reopened. I had my first real position, my first working job there. And I was doing temperature checks and logging patients before they could come in. So that was fun. I had been there 100 times before, but that was my first real job. And then I think I was 21 maybe. So about 3, 4 years ago, I started as an MA for the doctor that my mom spent the vast majority of her career as the solo DT for. So that was a really full circle moment. It was big shoes to fill because as soon as they saw my face, I look a lot like my mom, which is something to preface all of this with. But there was a little bit of expectation for me to just do what she would have done. And to the point that it was like, "Oh, Brie, we need a procedure in here. You have it, right?" "No, no, I do not. No, I'm an MA. I'm not a DT. Pump the brakes, please." But it was really special because I got to see those same patients, because I knew those doctors and the staff trusted me because I knew what I was doing and I could prove myself. So there was this thought of everyone wants me to be like my mom and I can't be, or I'm never going to come out of that shadow. But I realized very quickly that I was forging my own path. I was working in clinic and advocating for patients and fighting the fight and fighting with, insurance, even though we had a biologics department. I have a lot more sass than my mom does. So that kind of forged the way a little quicker as well. So I had to kind of adjust myself and realize like I'm not just in her shadow. We're on the same path. And it's a really cool experience because she's still in the field in some way. So there's a little
Yeah.
like, look at the two of us fighting from every direction. So.
Right. You ended up volunteering with NPF. And what else have you been up to?
So I volunteered for NPF throughout my childhood. I think I was 12 or 13 when my mom started a chapter in our area, and we kind of led that on. So I worked as an MA initially in our clinic. After that, I transitioned into a clinical research role. So same owners, two different kind of companies technically, still doing all derm clinical research. I was a patient recruiter. So my job was to find patients for all of the studies that were open that we were doing. So you get a really great perspective on how intricate biologics are in how they're made, how they're researched, what those kind of textbook perfect patients that they're looking for are, which really helped me when I came into doing biologic coordinating to understand the severity, the scales and those numbers that were used in studies are what those insurance companies and payers base their coverage off of. And understanding how to use those scoring tools, what those look like, what the severity is, the importance of including special areas, all of that detail that you kind of pick up over time as a biologic coordinator, I saw in practice in research. So that was really helpful. I also worked really closely with the IHHS, so International Hyperhidrosis Society. That is quite a passion of mine. Those patients are just really special, and that's a really kind of unique derm thing that not a lot of providers do. And I've really enjoyed getting to work with them over several years. Again, something my mom did when I was a kid that I kind of went to a couple conferences when I was younger. And then when I started with the practice, because it was all one big family, here I came. And it's actually been
Yeah.
probably one of my favorite things to get to travel for every year.
So tell me more about that.
But hyperhidrosis is one of those things that there's not a lot of education in terms of treatment options.
Yeah.
Most people actually go undiagnosed because they don't have the conversation about being sweaty. They
Mm.
just think that that's how they are and that's it. And one of the most common treatments, and one that we would probably argue is the most beneficial, is Botox injections for hyperhidrosis. And those authorization processes are very similar to biologics. So people in office that are doing biologic coordinating need to have some sort of understanding of that if they have providers in that field. It's the same thing advocating for the patient, discussing those quality of life measures and how it's impacting them. Ultimately, it's a very under-discussed disease in general, and it's very under-researched. There's been a couple new things, but it's a very slow to grow, very much like HS, which forever you just had those antibiotics and that was it. And then Humira
Mhm.
came out for HS, and that was huge to
Yeah.
have. But then you had those patients that were on Humira and it stopped working or it wasn't enough. And so we were for what, 10 years probably, just that was the option. That was it. And then recently we've had the additional Cosentyx. And so there's a lot of development on the research side and other mechanisms of action. So we've seen JAKs come out in dermatology now, similar
Mhm.
to how they have in rheumatology long before. We're seeing research on that in HS. So there's a double-edged sword to the manufacturers doing all this research because they're doing it so they can make more money and get those sales. But there's been this like ignition in derm biologics in general to go into all of these different treatment options, to go into these different diseases. So where Humira did that very early, and they've had several indications for a long time, you're seeing everybody start to realize, and
Mhm.
that's kind of a race. So who can get to, prurigo nodularis first? Can we get this as well? Which fight it out, you guys, because the more options we have on the table for patients, the better. From a mechanism of action standpoint, you have these array of options, but from an access standpoint, we can tailor that. So somebody might have a better bridge program. Somebody might be preferred on an insurance plan, but the larger that kind of platter gets,
Mhm.
the better we are able to advocate for our patients and talk about our other options because they're there where they weren't
Right.
for a really long time. So,
Yeah. It does seem like it's made it a lot easier for access, especially now. One of my providers a while back had called and asked me, what's the easiest drug to get? And I'm like, whatever you want to get, like whatever you decide is necessary for your patient, that's what I'm going to work to get. It's not, a matter of, oh, this company is easier than this company, because now that playing field is kind of evened out a little bit. You've got so many options, and almost everyone has a bridge program, and it has, either support or some sort of assistance. And so there's access there, either whether it's samples or they can, go into a bridge program, right away, or whatever the case may be. So it's made it a lot easier. But I think the biggest challenge is understanding how to get that access, and
Right.
really helping offices understand that, okay, you got to break that stigma of, what can I
What's
get?
on formulary?
Yeah.
Right. That's
Yes.
not how we treat patients. And I do think there is a level of understanding when it comes to underinsured patients or government insured patients. We know
Hmm.
that there are donut holes in every instance. So there are some people who are not going to be able to make magic happen.
Hmm.
But if we get to that point, I'll let you know.
Hmm.
Don't make your decision as a doctor, as a provider on how to best treat your patient off of the insurance company. They are meant to support the patient, not dictate how the patient is treated or not
Right.
determine the patient's health. That's your job.
Hmm.
So I will support you in doing that 100%. My job
Yeah.
is to make that magic happen. And sometimes it is magic. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
programs you've never heard of. And I just recently had one, a new formulation came out, and I'm on the phone with an MSL I've never heard of going, when are we going to get these syringes? Because this little girl wants to do her injections. And so I don't bat an eyelash at it. And I don't want the provider or the patient to carry any concern, worry. That's not them. That's on me. And I don't worry because in this field, I think you learn very quickly, it's all problem solving. No one patient is ever the same. No one formulary is ever the same.
Hmm.
So whatever is in front of you now, how are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to approach it from here? And then you just follow the footsteps and you have a plan in mind. You have an ideal scenario. You know
Hmm.
what should happen, but you also know, okay, now what? If there's a turn or a veer off the path, let's
Hmm.
reevaluate. And that's how I explain it to my patients, coming back to that patient education and advocacy, those welcome calls that are so important, especially as a remote biologic coordinator. I'm in a whole other state for my patients, which they all point out because apparently I have an accent compared to everyone there, which is so fun. It's a nice icebreaker. But
Hmm.
one of the first things I say is, "Hi, my name is Brie. I work for this practice. My whole job is to support you from here on out for this new medication we're going on." I don't explain, "I'm working with your insurance." I don't start with, "We have approval," or "Here's your pharmacy." It's, "I am here for you in whatever that needs to look like for this drug. So if you need help, we get all the way down the road and you go to do that first injection at home and you get shaky and you just, you forgot that the video existed or you're not comfortable, it's a whole lot easier to call me than to call the office and get a voicemail and get a call 3 days later. I'm here.
Hmm.
That's what I'm here for. Because if I
Hmm.
do that once for that patient, their whole experience of being on a biologic has completely changed. And
100%.
those drugs are typically long term. Most of the time, we're having that conversation that this is not something that we can stop and expect this to go away. So you're telling a patient sometimes in their 20s, here's a shot you have to give yourself every week or every month forever. That's huge to swallow, especially if they hate needles. So just call me and we can talk about what's playing on the radio while you do it. Like, you can't assume that everyone has a support system.
Hmm.
And if I've been there with you from that prescription being written and explained how this is going to work and what our options are and who's going to call you, and if somebody else calls you and you don't know who they are, you can wait and just call me and check in. If I'm going to go through that whole process, we're friends by the end of this. I
Hmm.
am someone that they trust, and I have now bought in and care about them. So pick up the phone. I'll do your shot with you every month. I don't care. I don't think I have any patients that ever need that level of help, but I would absolutely support that. It's better than them not being on treatment.
Right. Or missing a dose, or, a misfire, I
Not
mean,
calling because
yeah.
they don't know that they can is never an option. I always want them to know if something doesn't seem right, if something's off this path of what I've explained to you, here's the next step. This person's going to call you, your specialty pharmacy. Manufacturer program is called this. If somebody from that company calls you, it's okay to talk to them because they do. They get these phone calls all the time and they don't know who's safe or not safe. And when you're talking about health information, you kind of get leery. especially when
Yeah.
it comes to Medicare patients who are, when they're going on these PAP programs, inundated with contacts. Most of them don't have an email address. Like, we are throwing a whole new world at these people. So, taking the time to explain what should happen and telling them if something comes outside of that, you don't have to have the right answer. You can
Yeah.
call me and I can either fix it or tell you what we need to do next.
Yeah.
It's not your job to know all of these things. Advocate for yourself, but also know that I'm here to be the backbone and support you in that.
Right. So do you think there's ever too much information for the patient? Because, when patients are leaving the office, they're probably not remembering majority of that information. And I always think of myself in the patient's shoes, right? I always think about, especially if they're new, getting,
Right.
newly diagnosed with, eczema or psoriasis or whatever, or maybe they've been diagnosed, but maybe it's gotten worse and now they're at the point where they need a biologic, whatever the case may be. Maybe they're brand new to biologics. And, now we're talking about this injection and we're talking about, okay, you've got to do labs, you've got to do this and don't do live vaccines and, all of this information that they're throwing at the patient. And you're like, okay, like I got to take all this in and then you got to sign this form. And then we're also
And you
going to
don't even know
check
what
your
you're
insurance
signing.
card. Right. We
Yeah.
don't know what your copay is going to be. We don't know if your insurance is going to cover it. You've got to come back in because this is every 4 weeks or every 2 weeks or, every 6 weeks or 8 weeks, you've got to do this injection for the rest of your life. And then you might get clear. But if it doesn't work, we've got other options,
Right.
so it's like, oh my gosh, what is going on? I would be going crazy and then leaving without the medication because it hasn't been approved.
Right.
And
Or
now
leaving
I've got
with
to
a
figure out.
sample that you've done in the office and them going, hopefully it'll get to you in 2 or 3 weeks. You're like,
By your
okay.
next injection.
Right. So you just stabbed me with something that I don't even know who's going to call me to send it if that
Hmm.
happens. And they do. They leave it, especially when it comes to disease education. I
Yeah.
assume, one, I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving medical advice. I can share based off of what the doctor has shared, but I'm not going outside of that scope by
Hmm.
any means.
Right.
So you really do, as a coordinator, have to know your providers a little bit. And it's a learning curve, especially when you're a remote coordinator. I've never seen their faces. I have almost 30 providers. I know what one of them looks like. I couldn't talk to him on the phone. I couldn't pick him up out of a lineup. I have no idea. But you learn quickly through their chart notes and through interacting with their patients what level of conversation is happening there. A lot of doctors don't understand the access process. Most MAs don't understand the access process. They have enough to explain our biologic coordinator is going to contact you. Most offices now are relying on a handout that it sort of explains what those next steps are going to be. And that's super important because whatever you're saying in the room is not being retained. It could be some of it, but one, you're saying it orally to them. Two, white coat syndrome is a thing whether you think you have it or not, whether we know who they are or not. A doctor has just told us you have an autoimmune condition or you have a lifelong disease. You have something that needs to be treated with an injection. Your ears turn off, whether you want them to or not. You can't stop the emotional reaction there or the weight of that kind of statement. Even when doctors are really empathetic and really great about how they explain that, it has to be done in small doses. So, disease education to understand within the room, to understand it enough to be comfortable and understand that it needs to be treated. In
Hmm.
the room, then talking about treatment options, relying on your expertise. Don't go into every mechanism of action for psoriasis. There's like 15. You probably can't name them. I can't name them off the top of my head. You talk about what direction you want to go, you justify it to a point, but you keep it vague. You talk about what our next steps look like. So we're going to send you home. You'll be getting a call from the biologic department. They'll explain XYZ. Having it all in digestible bites, but supporting that with resources. So every piece of that should come along with a website, a PDF, a handout where they can do more research if they want to, because they probably will. They'll probably go home and go, oh, I have no idea what's happening. I have no idea what this really means. So providing them the right resources to do that research. So they're not getting on WebMD and looking up and going down the rabbit hole of all of the things that could be wrong with them or all of the complications that might exist. It's important that we acknowledge those And almost all documentation from manufacturers do a great job of that. But we don't want patients to be taken over by fear because we didn't guide them to the right information or use our expertise and knowledge to reassure them and support them.
Mhm.
So I hope my offices don't go too in detail with the access process. Let them know I'll call them, let them know it's a medication that's going to be shipped. Beyond that, you give them this little bit, you explain it enough that it's understandable, and there's a level of reassurance to this whole process, right? We're
Right.
with you through this. There's these resources you can look at. Call us. Set up a follow-up appointment. That's one of my biggest hangups is if a patient is leaving to start an injection, or if a patient is leaving for the first time with a new diagnosis, especially when it comes to autoimmunes, do not let them walk out without a follow-up appointment because there's a chance that they're going to go home overwhelmed and scared and shut down. So we need to show them that it's important for you to come back and we want you to.
Mhm.
It's not on you to know that you need to come back. You don't know which direction is up right now. I want to see you because I care enough to make sure you're okay. I want to check back in with you. That alone can make a whole world of a difference. That's what makes patients pick up the prescription
Mhm.
instead of just never going to Walgreens.
Yeah.
So, and it's little, it doesn't take a lot. It can be an automatic process. You don't have to actively think about that if you start incorporating it into your practice, which is where for me, the education that I'm doing with you and BC educators, I have such a passion for it because it doesn't have to be hard.
Right.
I know that the level of dedication that I put into what I do every day is far beyond what's probably healthy for me as a person to take on my own shoulders. But I've created processes for myself that
Mhm.
it's not so bad. And there's ways to not do quite as much as I do, but to really do your job and do it well and not be constantly trying to catch up or
Mhm.
constantly overwhelmed. There's not an even process. There's not a perfect way ever. But
Yeah.
if you build a good approach and a good organization and you have your own resources the same way you have those patient resources, it
Mhm.
takes a little bit of that weight off every time. And
Yeah.
so then the changes and the veering off the path isn't so impactful. It's not that big of a deal because you go, okay, and I'm going to turn this direction because you have a direction to go. You've started to map yourself out. So for me, that's
Yeah.
where not only educating patients, but working together as coordinators within things like BC Collab and other groups, PAMS conferences, places where we can gather and share what
Mhm.
we do to help each other's processes. And having those resources, again, that I think are really hard to find that are coordinator specific right now. It's
Mhm.
easy to go out and find manufacturers, access forms or an appeal letter sample. But what are you doing to organize yourself every day? How are you tracking what you're doing? All of those little things, we've all just kind of like figured it out trial by fire wise, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Mhm.
We could automate this or kind of standardize the system. So,
Yeah. There's so many different ways to get the access. And now we've got new coordinators, and I feel like there's always new coordinators. And then there's always, coordinators that have been doing this for so long. But I feel like I'm always learning something new. I'm always trying to improve my process, trying to figure out, okay, who can I learn from that can bring a different perspective? Maybe what I've been doing is a little bit old school or as old school as it could be. Biologics haven't been out for that long, but
well, no, but you used to,
yeah.
have to write a letter every time. It
Right.
wasn't, PAs didn't exist. So there
Right.
is,
And yeah, and insurance changes, formularies change all
like,
the time. And now you deal with a whole new slew of, these carve out plans that don't cover specialty medications or are pushing patients to go directly to a patient assistance program when they're commercially
that they
insured
don't qualify for.
and they don't qualify for. I'm like, okay, have these insurance companies not gotten the memo? Because they're not getting it.
No.
But like you said, though, it's so important to be able to collaborate and stay involved and connected in a community, especially as a bio coordinator, because there's so many things that are changing. And that's the only way that we can make change happen is by getting together and learning and growing together. And, I love that there's so many more options now than there were in the past. And there's so much learning that can be done. It's definitely something that is constantly changing and constantly evolving. But like you said, you can kind of standardize that process, especially in an office, and knowing, even through the webinar series that we did, the first one about the whole office playing an important role. I am a huge believer in that. I started as a coordinator and it was always like, oh, send this to the coordinator. They can do it. But
Right,
it shouldn't be that way. Then it was like pulling teeth trying to get everybody else to say, hey, front desk, I really need you to get those pharmacy benefit cards, or,
right.
MAs, I really need to make sure that this documentation is done well because I'm working overtime trying to call the patient again to get that pharmacy benefit card, or to call the patient's local pharmacy to get their benefit information, and then calling the patient again to find out what they've tried and failed, or if they in fact were on another topical or another biologic in the past. Going back and doing all that extra work, it wastes so much time. So if those people were able to, understand that, okay, specialty medications, there's a lot that is involved in this. And
It doesn't have to be someone's full responsibility to do the whole thing. Because, like I said earlier, I'm not a doctor. I
mhm,
can't provide a BSA. I need that to be given to me. I
mhm,
can't evaluate a patient or counsel a patient one direction or another. So, if my chart note is missing all of that information, one, I know I need it for insurance, but two, I can't help the patient in any of that. If it's not there, I don't have the basis.
mhm,
So things like docs drop a psoriasis diagnosis, they might even give you BSA and they'll put in there discuss treatment options. And then I get a task, initiate authorization for blah, blah, blah drug. I need that in the chart, buddy. I can't just write a prescription for you that's not documented. I need, just put the word somewhere on there. It's like anything is better than what we're working on. And it's not their fault that they don't know. They went to medical school. They didn't go to access school. Lord, imagine if there was an access school. That would be like a whole game changer, right?
yeah,
Biologics one.
that'd
Yeah.
be changing every single month.
It would be, yeah, there's no point because you just throw it out the window every month. But they don't have to understand the whole thing. I just need them to know this little piece. And if it comes from using those clinical trials and showing them, do you see how the indication is written? I need your note to mirror this in some way. These are the pieces that you need. A lot of manufacturers have created some provider facing documents to try to do that. But I think ultimately, if you're using EHRs like Emma now, that's so prevalent in derm, and I know we're getting more specific EHRs in other fields as well, they're prompting those things. You put
Mhm.
psoriasis, and the first thing that pops up is BSA PGA. Don't skip it, just put it in. I know it's
Mhm.
going to take a couple days of getting used to that, but it does matter for coverage. Again, here's the part you play in ensuring your patient actually gets treatment.
Right.
Front desk, I need you to look at the patient and not, I know you're frustrated. I know they take the brunt of everyone's anger and frustration. They are superheroes in the world, and I think they don't get enough credit. But remember, when a patient's coming into you with something like psoriasis, whether you know what they're here for or not, something had to be bad enough for them to seek help. Have empathy in that direction. Don't project your negativity on someone who had to admit to themselves and seek out help because they got to a point where they weren't okay anymore. At a base level, if we make sure that we're looking at every patient from
Mhm.
that lens, it makes it a whole lot easier for them and for us to keep in mind why we do what we do, to
Right.
remember why those little things that feel really annoying, like having to remind them of a BSA or having to ask for a pharmacy benefit card, that's why it matters because they need help. And if we don't check our little box and do our little piece of the puzzle, they're still miserable. Now they've come in and asked for help and they're not getting it. Imagine that impact, and it's not, we're not asking anything big of anybody, right? The whole
Yeah.
process is I just need a little piece from you here, a little piece from you there. Here are the documents. I'll give you those patient resources. Just care enough, just commit for a week to trying it. I know it doesn't sound good. I know it's just another thing to have to do. And as someone who's been in MA, you get 50 phone calls, 75 patients a day, and a doctor that's all the chart notes as you're, 5 patients down the line. I get it. I've been there. But try it for a week. Let it become comfortable. let it become normal, and you'll realize after a little bit, it's not a big thing. It doesn't take that much. It's just that adjustment period, and it
Right.
makes a massive impact for your patients.
Absolutely. And then it keeps your patients coming back. They begin to form that confidence in knowing that, okay, this is where I need to be because they're really trying hard to help me.
There
They
is
really
help
want to
here,
make sure
right?
that I'm getting everything. Even if this medication doesn't work, there's another option and they're working hard to make sure that I am getting the support that I need. And
Right.
that's so important.
It is. And it's hard with large offices, right? You've
Hmm.
got a ton of patients and it's overwhelming, and you can't really tell them, just call me if you need something, because you can't. And it's impossible to do all of that. But providing those resources again of where to find some of that information and what the expected plan is, what we think the road's going to look like. Call me when things go off the path.
Hmm.
Call me when something doesn't make sense. So you're helping to advocate for them and engage them enough to do it on their own,
Hmm.
and then providing them a safe place if that doesn't work. When you build in those automated processes or have those standards of care in these different positions and in these different documents, it makes the weight of all of those patients and all of that work not so bad, because you know you did that work already.
Yeah.
You already advocated for them, and now that's happening behind you in the background without you having to do it every moment. So
Hmm.
that's what
Advocacy is a beautiful thing.
it is a beautiful thing, and it is something that I think it takes a very specific person and a very specific personality to
Yeah.
do. But we are really lucky to have that, right? Like it's such a gift to do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. I really appreciate your time and sitting down with me and chatting about this because it's huge. It's so important. The patient education side, I think I love your passion for it. And it's such an important topic. It's such an important thing for our patients to make sure that they're getting the education, the resources, the support that they deserve. That's one of the biggest things, when you're looking for a provider, you want to get that support, you want to get answers. So being able to support that, supporting our providers, supporting the office staff, and helping get that access, I think it's so commendable. I think it's such an amazing work and it's so fun. And I love that I get to work with you on this.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me and listening to That's Derm Good. You can expect new episodes of That's Derm Good every week. The podcast is available on your favorite app, including where you're listening right now. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a new episode. Bye.